It will not be because we want to create some kind of confrontation, but because there is no choice but to enforce the standards that the international community has worked on for so long.
So we condemn Russia's moves to formally annex the Crimean region of Ukraine. Such action is a threat to international peace and security, and it is against international law.
Okay, so in short, administration, bad Russia. But really, what can they do about it? Sanctions. 10 guys got their assets frozen. One of them wasn't Vladimir Putin, by the way. But we've had a lot of talk, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of consensus, both from the EU and then also from our folks. So NATO isn't exactly on the same page here. Can anyone really do anything about it? Can you really hit them in the pocketbook and make a difference?
Well, so the sanctions are on a ratchet, right? So this was the first click on the ratchet, and it's not very far. And conceivably, they can go further. But the reality is not much. A couple of years ago already, Putin took his ministers aside and he said, look, if you have any assets in the US, pull them out. Because if something like this happens, I'm not responsible for it. So I'm giving you fair warning now. So, you know, the problem here is that Germany relies on Russia for gas and that London relies on Russian oil and gas cash to run the financial markets. And so there's a meaningful reticence to push stronger sanctions.
Well, in your professional opinions, Americans that are concerned about this situation, do they have to worry about possible American military action, or that's way out the question?
I think it's way out of the question. I think that's why Putin is able to inch this along and consider, well, maybe I'll take a little bit of eastern Ukraine and things like that, because he knows that we're not going to act. And we shouldn't act.
Not even flyover missions?
We might do some flyover missions, but he knows it's not going to go further than that. So
because there's no taste for it, there's no stomach for it here, or because there's really nothing we could effectively do?
War is an extension of foreign policy, and at this point, it just wouldn't be effective foreign policy to try to have a shooting war with the Russians. And as we were talking at the break, the superb way that the Russian military has acted has been something that we've not seen before in history. This is normally a conquering army, and there'd be a wake of bodies and blood in its path. That hasn't happened here. So the world is not as shocked about what happened. And until that happens, you won't see Americans.
A couple of weeks ago, we thought with these kind of like rogue guys or these, that it was inevitable you were going to have shootouts in the streets of Kiev, and it never happened. Now, to that end, there's been two schools of thought. We talked about this before. One has nothing to do with the other, and the president's inaction, let's say, on Syria, it wasn't the cue for Putin to say, hey, I got a wimp in the White House, let's move now on Crimea. On the flip side, some have said, in fact, that does play into it. People like Senator McCain, Mitt Romney, they said that there has been a projection that the U.S. has no more stomach for this. Certainly after Iraq and Afghanistan, we've got our own problems right now. We don't want to be fighting a war in another continent or have any other additional concerns. Is it a little bit of both or no?
I think that no matter who's in the White House, the strategic situation is the United States is coming off of the two longest wars in its history. There's no stomach for military action here. Furthermore, if you look at the hard strategic calculations of our interests in that region, there's no meaningful reason to go to war there. So whoever is in the White House, whatever they said, Vladimir Putin would still arrive at the same answer when he did his strategic calculations on whether or not to take Crimea or not take Crimea. That said, right, I think there's certainly a case to be made that the White House has signaled that it's not going to do anything. And maybe it could have signaled differently, but I don't think that would have made any difference. Historically,
people have written extensively that the Kremlin reads a lot more into the body language, the volume of tone than certainly we do and allies, that it means something to them how actions are projected as much as actions themselves. Is that fair?
I don't know if they do that more than we do. I think they certainly take that into account, and that's a classic part of that's what the part of the KGB that Vladimir Putin worked in did. They're very expert at this kind of disinformation, this kind of use of biographical data and nonverbal cues to read these things. And so, you know, we do it too. We just don't talk about it.
Do you think Syria had anything to do with this?
I think it did. I mean, we had every president since the Second World War try to keep Russia and Russian influence out of that part of the world. We had them out, in fact, but somehow over a weekend they got invited back to the table, had a major a part of it, kept the Assad government in there. We're, maybe a good result about getting chemical weapons out, but fundamentally we have too much Russian influence there. But getting back, looking through the eyes of Russia here, there should have been a plan someplace in the CIA headquarters that said this should surprise nobody. This is a strategic piece of land that this is how they were going to get it done by, and this is what they were going to do, and we should have had some kind of position paper that said this is what our response is going to be. Just look at the map and determine how important the Crimea is to Russia.
For me, Mike, what still surprised me is, okay, whether we said it loud or we said it in muted tones, where's NATO on this and where's Europe on this? It seems to surprise us a little bit that Germany and to a degree England couldn't get on the same page with everybody else, and at least even condemning this is loud. Forget about taking some material action. That was, at least for some, and at least for me, a little surprising that, like you said, this thing was telegraphed, right? Why didn't we at least get our ducks in a row and at least have something more coherent than, hey, you 10 guys, we're going to freeze your accounts? I mean, it came off as weak, no?
I think it did.
Yeah.
There's nothing more to say, but there's not much we can do.
Yeah.
I want to, if I could, you mentioned NATO and looking at the map of NATO and the NATO countries, and you were talking before about possible future targets if Russia wanted to expand. NATO was formed to stop Russian advancement. If any of those countries that are in blue wind up the subject of Russian aggression, is there any reason to think that NATO would actually respond militarily, the U.S. being a part of NATO, considering that's essentially the process that got us into the First and the Second World Wars? Right. Our alliances and our allies were attacked.
Yeah, let's hope he doesn't, kind of press that button. I do think they would. They would give more than enough warning, and there would be clearly an air campaign. There is an air I know there is an air campaign on the shelf someplace that they would take off, dust off, and say this is what we're going to execute. In fact, if we get any kind of attack on a NATO country, we had it during the Cold War. It was called 33006, and it was something that we planned for, we trained at. So there's a plan that says should Russia roll tanks through Ukraine into Poland, we'll respond.
Right, but that's not going to happen. Russia is not engaged in a campaign to get back land a la World War II. The campaign is what you saw in Crimea. You've got highly, highly trained and disciplined Spetsnaz, special forces, that go in whose primary job is to make sure that nobody gets killed. Understand that. Yeah. The thing that could have derailed this for Putin was if his troops had bloodshed in Crimea. What allowed it to happen was the lack of bloodshed. So he's not going to roll tanks in anywhere. It's going to happen the same way you saw in Crimea. And I don't think it's going to happen in any NATO country. It's not going to happen in Estonia. It may happen yet in further parts of Ukraine. But
listen, man, I'm curious. In the last couple of days, we've heard Putin say, among other things, I don't want to hear from the U.S. in effect on this. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. You guys have done expansionism. He doesn't really believe that and make a parallel. It just makes a good soundbite. He doesn't even buy that, does he? That there's a comparison.
Right, but it's more than just making a good soundbite. It's the same way that he said, those aren't our troops. It leaves his options open.
Gambling? What gambling?
Right, and we in the West, we look at him and we think, what a buffoon, right? I mean, how could he really expect us to believe that those aren't Russian troops? But the fact that he maintained that charade and that his senior ministers maintained that charade kept his strategic options open. That's what he's doing with that kind of language. He knows the truth, and he knows we don't buy it, but all he needs is that thinnest veneer of deniability, and he still has 2 or 3 options open.
Mike, if to you, what are the storylines you're most interested in that could or couldn't play out in the next 6 months here, that the people should look for? That, okay, we saw this chapter here, thankfully there's no bloodshed, the names changed here, but didn't radically alter the world. What are you looking about and are a little nervous about that could play out between now and the end of the year?
In the short term was how were the 20,000 Ukraine sailors and airmen and soldiers getting out of Crimea safely with their families amongst weapons and amongst all those things. Now I guess from today's reports it looks like that's going to happen peacefully, but that is a huge humanitarian mission that could still go wrong. It could still go very wrong. Then the next thing comes back to just watching. What happens in Ukraine politically? What exactly do they do? Do they start moving some conventional forces? Again, if I'm anywhere running that government, they've got to shore up at least a little bit their eastern border. They have to at least give the impression to Russia that if you decide to cross the border, we're going to at least give you a fight. Whether that's suicide or not remains to be seen.
See, I disagree. But I'll get to that point in a second. I think that what you look at next is the population moves. out of Crimea. So what do you do with the Crimean Tatars and the ethnic Ukrainians? Will they go? Won't they go? How does that transaction happen? I think it's clear that the provisional government in Kiev is focused on consolidating their power and consolidating the revolution, trying to install a democratic government that functions, and that's more important than Crimea. So they're letting Crimea go. I think that there is room for them to give up parts of eastern Ukraine. They don't want to, but there's room for them to give that up if they deem it necessary in order to consolidate a strong government in Kiev. And I think that if push comes to shove, they will give up parts of eastern Ukraine. And I don't think they will move troops there. I think they understand that that's the wrong thing to do.
But you said before that he's got his eyes on the prize, which is Kiev. That doesn't get him there. So why would he agree to that? Why would that? Eventually, there's going to be a conflict then in Kiev.
I think that in Vladimir Putin's fantasy land, if he could get Kiev, he would. But he knows that he can't. So he's going to do the next best thing. So Kiev is going to stay Ukrainian, but parts of eastern Ukraine may not. Again, I'm not saying he's going to do this. I'm saying he has very carefully left open the option of continuing to move troops into eastern Ukraine. He's created a situation where if the right opportunity arises, if there are the right kinds of killings, and he can make a strong claim, for instance, that the Russian population is under threat by Ukrainian fascists, right? That will give him the entree to do what he did in Crimea, to move in special operations forces, right? And to take control of the area without firing a shot.
You know, Mike, just when you think that there couldn't be enough headaches here at state, defense, or for that matter in the White House, now you got to worry about all of a sudden the Russian bear all over again here. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. Fascinating conversation. Matt, Mike, thank you very much. Okay, when we come back, we'll switch gears from foreign policy to an issue, and it's ticking the clock on it. Health insurance, Obamacare, and specifically young folks. The NBA gets in the game with the White House in a move to try and get the young people to sign up. They passed the 5 million mark here, but March 31st is an important date. We'll tell you why. We'll tell you what kind of progress or lack thereof they're making with a population they have to get to make this plan of the president's work. Stay with us.